The engines of the B-24 Liberator roared at maximum continuous power as First Lieutenant Doug Craig checked his fuel gauges for the 15th time in as many minutes. It was 3:30 in the morning on August 13, 1943, and his bomber, Shady Lady, had been airborne for nearly 14 hours. The math was simple and terrifying. They'd covered roughly 2,200 miles from Darwin to Balikpapan and back, dodged Japanese fighters over Timor, and now the fuel needles were kissing empty. Below, the Australian coastline should have been visible in the pre-dawn darkness, but Craig was 100 miles off course. His navigator, fighting tropical thunderstorms and mechanical failures for the entire flight, had done his best. It just wasn't good enough. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The crew knew what happened when B-24 Seconds ditched in the ocean. The roll-up bomb bay doors, designed for efficiency in the air, became death traps in water. They'd crush inward on impact, the fuselage scooping seawater so violently the aircraft would break in half and sink within seconds. Statistics said 2 survivors out of 10 in a water landing. Craig scanned the darkness ahead and saw salvation in the form of a pale stretch of salt pan. Not a proper airfield, not even a road, just flat, hard ground that might, if luck was with them, support 66,000 pounds of aircraft running on fumes and desperation. He brought Shady Lady in, low and dirty, no time for a proper approach, just controlled desperation as the main gear kissed earth and the bomber rolled across the salt flat, finally shuddering to a stop. The crew sat in stunned silence for a moment, then began the laborious process of climbing out. They'd been airborne for 16 hours and 35 minutes. As Craig stepped onto Australian soil, exhausted beyond measure, he found himself surrounded by dozens of Aboriginal people who'd heard the aircraft's distress and come to investigate. Craig tried sign language, exaggerated gestures attempting to communicate their situation. The Aboriginal leader watched this performance for perhaps 30 seconds before asking in perfect English, "What are you trying to say?" This wasn't supposed to be possible. The B-24 Liberator, for all its production numbers, had developed a reputation problem by mid-1943 that no amount of factory output could fix. Among the bomber crews in England, flying with the 8th Air Force, the aircraft had acquired unflattering nicknames that spoke volumes about how pilots and crew felt about their assigned mount. The Flying Coffin was perhaps the kindest. The Flying Boxcar referenced its ungainly profile. Some crews called it the crate the B-17 came in, a cutting comparison to the beloved flying fortress that dominated the skies over Germany. The criticisms were rooted in real operational differences. The B-24's high aspect ratio, Davis wing, revolutionary in its efficiency, created problems in other areas. The shoulder-mounted wing, with its single main spar, placed enormous structural loads on the fuselage, making the aircraft prone to catastrophic failure under stress. There were documented instances of pilots successfully landing their damaged Liberators, only to have the fuselage crumple under its own weight, crushing the crew inside. The aircraft was notoriously difficult to fly, particularly at altitude. Control forces were heavy. Above 20 to 22,000 feet, the aircraft developed a lateral instability that required constant correction. There was a standing joke in the 8th Air Force that you could identify B-24 pilots by their overdeveloped left arms from fighting the controls. The German Luftwaffe had noticed the difference too. Intelligence reports and pilot debriefings revealed that German fighter pilots preferentially targeted B-24 formations over B-17 Seconds when both types were present. The Liberators' defensive armament, while substantial on paper with 10 50 caliber machine guns, was positioned less effectively than the B-17's 13 guns. More critically, the B-24 couldn't absorb damage the way a flying fortress could. The Davis wing that gave it range also made it vulnerable. A single 20mm cannon hit to the wing root could sever the main spar, causing catastrophic structural failure. B-17 crews began saying they didn't need fighter escorts when B-24 Seconds were along because the Germans would ignore them and hunt the easier targets. The casualty statistics supported this bitter observation. In the 8th Air Force, B-17 seconds averaged one Luftwaffe fighter destroyed for every 44 sorties. B-24 seconds managed one enemy fighter for every 87 sorties, almost half the effectiveness. Loss rates told a similar story. While both aircraft suffered terrible casualties in the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, B-24 groups consistently reported higher losses per mission than their B-17 counterparts. But the Luftwaffe's assessment was based on a specific operational context: the high-altitude daylight bombing campaign over heavily defended European targets. German fighter pilots and flak gunners encountered B-24 seconds operating at the edge of their performance envelope, flying formations at 25,000 feet, where the aircraft's handling problems were most pronounced, attacking targets within a few hundred miles of English bases. This was the B-24 forced to compete directly with the B-17's strengths, fighting a battle of attrition where survivability mattered more than range, and the Flying Fortress's superior high-altitude stability gave it a decisive advantage. What the Germans didn't understand, because they never encountered it, was what happened when the B-24 was employed in its designed role. When Lieutenant Colonel William A. Miller's 380th Bombardment Group arrived at bases near Darwin in northern Australia during the spring of 1943. They weren't there to compete with B-17 seconds. They were there to accomplish missions the Flying Fortress physically couldn't fly. The strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific demanded something the European theatre never required: extreme range combined with heavy payload. The Dutch East Indies stretched across 1 million square miles of ocean and jungle, containing oil refineries, shipping facilities, and airfields that were keeping the Japanese war machine supplied. Balikpapan, on the island of Borneo, was particularly critical. Intelligence indicated the refineries there produced more than half of Japan's aviation fuel and a substantial portion of their lubricating oils. It was essentially the Ploesti of the Pacific, except that Ploesti was 2,300 miles from the Allied airfields in North Africa. Balikpapan was 2,600 miles from Darwin. That extra 300 miles mattered because it pushed the mission beyond the B-17's operational radius. The Flying Fortress, for all its virtues, had a combat radius of approximately 2,000 miles with a useful bomb load. You could push it farther by reducing bombs and overloading fuel, but then you weren't accomplishing the mission. The B-24, with its efficient Davis wing and greater fuel capacity, could reach 2,850 miles with 5,000 pounds of bombs. On paper, that made Balikpapan theoretically possible, but just barely. There was no margin for error, no allowance for headwinds or navigation mistakes, no reserve for combat maneuvering. It would be the longest bombing mission anyone had attempted in World War II. Miller and his staff spent weeks calculating and recalculating the mission parameters. Each B-24 would need to carry 3,500 gallons of fuel, filling every available tank. That meant the aircraft would weigh nearly 66,000 pounds at takeoff, pushing the limits of what the landing gear and engines could handle. Crews would carry 6 500-pound bombs, enough to do real damage if they hit their targets, but light enough to preserve range. The flight plan called for individual aircraft navigation rather than formation flying, reducing drag and conserving fuel. Each bomber would take off from Darwin at 5-minute intervals, beginning at 5 in the evening, navigate independently across 2,000 miles of hostile ocean, arrive over Balikpapan around midnight, bomb their assigned targets, and fly back. Total mission time: approximately 17 hours. The margins were so tight that even minor problems would be catastrophic. An aircraft that ran into headwinds would burn extra fuel and might not make it home. An aircraft that got lost would run out of fuel over open ocean with no emergency landing fields available. An aircraft that encountered Japanese fighters and had to maneuver aggressively would burn fuel at an accelerated rate. The crews understood these realities. The 380th Bombardment Group wasn't composed of inexperienced pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These were veterans who'd completed combat training in the United States and spent weeks flying armed reconnaissance missions over the Dutch East Indies, familiarizing themselves with the distances, weather patterns, and Japanese defenses. They knew exactly how little room for error existed. On August 13, 1943, 12 B-24 seconds began their takeoff rolls from Darwin. One aircraft, experiencing mechanical problems shortly after becoming airborne, was forced to abort and return. The remaining 11 headed west across the Timor Sea, climbing to cruise altitude and settling into the long, monotonous flight that would define the next 14 hours. The route took them over Timor, where Japanese airfields were known to be active. Pilots maintained strict radio, silence, navigating by dead reckoning and occasional celestial shots when the tropical weather cleared enough to see stars. The weather was worse than forecast. Severe tropical thunderstorms created turbulence that tossed the heavy bombers around like toys, making it nearly impossible for navigators to get accurate position fixes. Some aircraft were blown miles off course. Others fought headwinds that consumed fuel at rates higher than planned. By the time the lead elements approached Balikpapan around midnight, only 9 of the 11 aircraft that had continued past Timor were in position to attack. What they found surprised them. The Japanese, believing Balikpapan was beyond the range of any Allied bomber, had left the city and harbour brightly illuminated. No blackout procedures, no combat air patrols overhead, just normal nighttime operations at a major fuel production facility that considered itself safely out of reach. Captain Gus Connery's B-24 arrived first at 12:20 in the morning. His bombardier had perhaps the easiest target identification of any bombing mission in the war. The refineries were lit up like Christmas, storage tanks clearly visible, ships in the harbour showing navigation lights. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. The first bombs were already falling before Japanese anti-aircraft crews realised they were under attack. Connery's aircraft bombed from minimum altitude, just above the rooftops, maximising accuracy at the cost of exposing itself to ground fire once the defences woke up. Behind him, the other 8 B-24 seconds came roaring in at intervals, each crew selecting targets of opportunity in the chaos. Some bombed the refineries, watching explosions blossom among the processing equipment. Others attacked the harbour, where tankers filled with refined fuel made spectacularly flammable targets. The Japanese response, once organised, was fierce. Anti-aircraft guns poured tracers into the sky. Searchlights swept back and forth, trying to illuminate the attackers. Lieutenant Bob Fleming's aircraft took cannon fire that wounded his bombardier, Lieutenant Elvin Mellinger, and started a fire in the nose compartment. Mellinger, bleeding from his wounds, dropped his bombs on a tanker and then fought the fire before allowing anyone to provide first aid. The same burst knocked out Fleming's No. 1 engine. Near Timor, on the return flight, No. 2 quit. The crew nursed their crippled bomber 400 miles on 2 engines before making a safe landing. Doug Craig's Shady Lady encountered Japanese fighters as they crossed back over Timor. The Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters, nicknamed Oscars by the Allies, were lighter and more manoeuvrable than the heavy B-24. Craig had no choice but to take evasive action, throwing the bomber into turns and dives that it wasn't designed for, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate while his gunners fought off the attacks. They escaped, but the price was measured in gallons of aviation, gasoline that Craig needed for the final leg home. That was how he ended up 100 miles off course, running on fumes, looking at a salt flat as his only option. The Aboriginal community that found Craig and his crew provided food, water, and protection until a rescue party arrived days later. But Shady Lady wasn't done. Australian engineers, working with minimal equipment in brutal conditions, repaired the aircraft well enough to fly it out. Weeks after its emergency landing, Shady Lady lifted off from that same salt flat and flew back to Darwin, where it was restored to full operational status and returned to combat. The August 13th raid was just the beginning. Intelligence photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft in the days following the attack showed extensive damage to the refineries and storage facilities. More importantly, they revealed that the Japanese had not increased their defences, apparently believing the first raid was an isolated event made possible by some trick or temporary circumstance. The 380th Bombardment Group returned on August 15th and again on August 17th, hitting Balikpapan 2 more times with similar results. In 3 missions, 20 sorties total, the group temporarily shut down the refineries, destroyed tens of thousands of tons of stored fuel, sank approximately 30,000 tons of shipping, and forced the Japanese to redeploy defensive forces from New Guinea to Borneo. For these actions, the 380th Bombardment Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation, one of only 2 they would earn during their service in Australia. The citation specifically noted the extraordinary range and difficulty of the missions, the innovative tactics employed, and the strategic impact achieved. But the most significant outcome wasn't the tactical success. It was what the missions demonstrated about the B-24 Liberator's capabilities when employed correctly. The aircraft that German pilots called an easy target, that European theatre crews considered inferior to the B-17, had just accomplished something no other Allied bomber could have done. They'd struck targets at extreme range, achieved strategic surprise, and returned home despite weather, mechanical failures, and enemy action. The B-24's range advantage, dismissed as irrelevant in the skies over Germany, where targets were relatively close, suddenly became its defining characteristic. The Luftwaffe never encountered B-24 seconds flying missions like this. German intelligence reports from the European theatre categorized the Liberator as slower than the B-17 at altitude, less maneuverable, more vulnerable to damage, and equipped with inferior defensive armament. All of these assessments were technically accurate for high-altitude formation bombing. None of them captured what the B-24 could do when range became the critical factor. The aircraft's Davis wing, considered a structural weakness in combat, was actually the masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency that enabled endurance no other heavy bomber could match. The Consolidated Aircraft Corporation had designed the B-24 inches 1938 with a specific requirement in mind: exceed the B-17's performance in every measurable category. The Army Air Corps had initially approached Consolidated about building B-17 seconds under license, helping Boeing meet production demands. Reuben Fleet, Consolidated's president, had visited Boeing's Seattle facility, examined the flying fortress, and made a decision that would shape the entire war in the Pacific. He told the Army he could build a better aircraft. The result was revolutionary in ways that wouldn't become apparent until aircraft like the 380th B-24 seconds started flying missions that pushed beyond normal operational boundaries. The Davis wing was the key innovation, a high aspect ratio design that generated lift far more efficiently than conventional wings. In practical terms, this meant the B-24 could carry more weight farther on the same amount of fuel. The trade-off was structural complexity and handling characteristics that made the aircraft less forgiving to fly. Boeing's engineers had prioritized stability and durability. Consolidated's engineers had prioritized efficiency and range. Neither philosophy was wrong. They simply optimized for different mission profiles. The B-17 was perfect for the massed daylight raids over Germany, where formations of hundreds of bombers needed to maintain tight defensive boxes at high altitude, absorbing fighter attacks and flak while staying on course to the target. The B-24 was perfect for the Southwest Pacific, where individual aircraft or small formations flew marathon missions to isolated targets, where the distance to the target mattered more than the ability to absorb punishment, and where getting home depended on fuel efficiency rather than structural resilience. The 380th Bombardment Group's operations, from Darwin through late 1943 and into 1944, illustrated this perfectly. While B-17 groups in Europe were flying missions of 4 to 6 hours duration, attacking targets within 300 miles of their bases, the 380th routinely launched missions lasting 12 to 14 hours, attacking targets 1,000 miles away. Their operational area covered 1 million square miles, from the oil refineries at Surabaya on Java to airfields in New Guinea to naval bases in the Bismarck Archipelago. In October 1943, they participated in a major strike against Rabaul, one of Japan's most heavily fortified bases. Weather prevented them from reaching the primary target, but the fact they'd even attempted a mission to Rabaul from Darwin, a distance that would have been impossible for B-17 seconds, demonstrated the fundamental difference between the two aircraft. The 380th wasn't operating in the B-17's shadow. They were operating in places where B-17 seconds couldn't go. The group developed specialized techniques for maximizing the B-24's range. They discovered that by carefully managing engine power settings, using what they called cruise control techniques, they could extend their radius of action by hundreds of miles. This required precise coordination between pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer, constantly monitoring fuel consumption, adjusting mixture ratios, and operating engines at the sweet spot where power output balanced against fuel efficiency. German bomber crews never developed these techniques because the Luftwaffe didn't need them. German bombers operated within a few hundred miles of their bases, attacking Britain, Russia, or Mediterranean targets within easy reach. The concept of 14-hour missions to targets 2,000 miles away was simply outside their operational paradigm. This became particularly relevant when comparing the B-24 to German bomber designs. The Heinkel He 177, Germany's primary heavy bomber, had a combat radius of approximately 1,000 miles. The Junkers Ju-88, while versatile, maxed out around 850 miles. These aircraft were designed for the European theatre where everything was relatively close together. A mission from Berlin to Moscow was only 1,000 miles. A mission from occupied France to London was barely 200 miles. The idea of routinely flying bombers 2,600 miles to hit a target and return was beyond German strategic thinking. The Royal Australian Air Force, which had operational control over the 380th, understood exactly what they had. Australian military planners looked at their strategic situation, isolated in the South Pacific, with Japanese forces controlling vast territories to the north, desperately needing to strike at Japanese logistics and infrastructure, and recognized that the B-24's range made operations possible that would otherwise require aircraft. Carriers moved within striking distance, exposing them to Japanese attack. The 380th could strike from Darwin, beyond the reach of Japanese carrier aviation, hitting targets the Japanese considered safely out of range. Throughout 1944, the group flew mission after mission that redefined what heavy bomber operations could accomplish. They attacked the nickel refinery at Pomela on Celebes Island, a facility supplying 80% of Japan's nickel requirements. The attacks were so effective and so sustained that the refinery remained out of commission until Allied ground forces recaptured the area. They struck shipping in the Halmahera Islands, airfields across New Guinea, and repeatedly hit the oil infrastructure at Balikpapan and Surabaya. Each mission reinforced the same fundamental reality. The B-24 could reach places and sustain operations that other aircraft couldn't. The irony was that while the Liberator struggled with its reputation in BATTT, Europe, being compared unfavorably to the B-17 by crews and commanders who valued survivability over range, it was simultaneously proving itself indispensable in the Pacific. By April and May of 1944, when the Allies prepared to invade Hollandia in New Guinea, the 380th received a specific assignment that highlighted their unique capabilities. They were to attack Japanese positions on the Vogelkop Peninsula, protecting the western flank of the Allied advance, hitting airfields so far from friendly bases that no other bomber could reach them. These missions, flown largely unconnected to the main air effort, required the B-24 to operate alone without the massive fighter escorts and supporting formations that characterized operations in Europe. On May 19, 1944, 13 B-24 seconds from the group encountered 6 Japanese Ki-44 Shoki fighters. The B-24 gunners and escort fighters shot down 5 of them. For this sustained effort in April and May, repeatedly hitting extremely distant targets and enabling the Hollandia invasion, the 380th received its second Distinguished Unit citation. The Germans never called the B-24 slow because they never encountered it in circumstances where its speed mattered. In high-altitude formation bombing over Europe, the Liberator was marginally faster than the B-17, perhaps 30 miles per hour at cruise speed, but that difference disappeared in formation where everyone flew at the speed of the slowest aircraft. The B-24's real advantage was its ability to cruise efficiently for hours longer than the B-17, maintaining speed while consuming less fuel per mile traveled. This wasn't dramatic or visually impressive, but it was the difference between mission impossible and mission accomplished when targets were 2,000 miles away. By early 1945, when the 380th moved from Darwin to Mindoro in the Philippines, they'd been flying marathon missions continuously for nearly 2 years. The group had perfected long-range bomber operations to a degree no other unit could match. From their new bases, they struck targets on Formosa, French Indochina, and the Asian mainland, missions that again pushed the boundaries of what heavy bombers could accomplish. In June 1945, they participated in the pre-invasion bombardment of Brunei and Balikpapan in Borneo, flying repeated strikes that kept those targets under aerial siege for nearly 2 weeks. The final accounting of the 380th's operations tells a story that never made it into the popular narrative about World War II heavy bombers. While B-17 seconds rightfully earned their reputation bombing Germany, and while B-24 seconds in Europe struggled with an unfavorable comparison, the 380th and other B-24 units in the Pacific were writing a different chapter entirely. They flew longer missions, hit more distant targets, and operated in conditions where the B-24's range was not just advantageous, but absolutely essential. The aircraft's weaknesses in close-quarter combat with German fighters became irrelevant. Its structural vulnerabilities mattered less when most missions didn't face the concentrated flak and fighter opposition of the European theatre. What mattered was getting to the target and getting home, and for that mission, the B-24 had no equal. The German Luftwaffe's intelligence assessment of Allied bomber capabilities in 1943 was comprehensive, detailed, and completely blind to what was happening in the Pacific. Captured documents and post-war interrogations reveal that German analysts had developed sophisticated understanding of B-17 and B-24 performance in the European theatre. They knew the B-24 cruised at roughly 215 miles per hour, compared to the B-17's 182. They knew it carried a similar bomb load over slightly longer distances. They understood its defensive, armament layout, and its structural vulnerabilities. What they didn't know, because they had no way to know, was that somewhere beyond their operational awareness, B-24 seconds were routinely flying missions that exceeded German bomber range by factors of 2 or 3. The He-177, Germany's most advanced heavy bomber, had a combat radius of approximately 1,000 miles. The concept of a bomber flying 1,300 miles to a target, attacking it, and flying 1,300 miles back was simply outside German operational thinking. Their entire bomber force was designed for the European theatre, where targets were measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. Japanese intelligence faced similar blind spots. Through 1942 and early 1943, Japanese defensive planning in the Dutch East Indies assumed that Allied bombers couldn't reach targets like Balikpapan from any existing Allied base. The math seemed straightforward. The nearest Allied airfields were in northern Australia, over 2,000 miles away. No bomber had that kind of range. The refineries and shipping facilities at Balikpapan operated under full illumination at night because Japanese commanders believed they were immune to air attack. That assumption cost them when the 380th B-24 seconds arrived overhead in August 1943. Even after the initial raids, Japanese intelligence struggled to understand how the attacks were possible. Intelligence reports captured after the war show, Japanese analysts initially believed the B-24 seconds must have staged through some undiscovered Allied base closer to Borneo, perhaps a secret airfield in the islands between Australia and the target. The alternative, that American bombers were flying round trips of over 5,000 miles, seemed impossible. It took months of additional raids and reconnaissance before Japanese headquarters accepted that the B-24's range really was sufficient to strike from Darwin to the deepest parts of the Dutch East Indies and return. This intelligence failure had strategic consequences. Japanese defensive resources, already stretched thin across a vast Pacific theatre, were allocated based on perceived threat ranges. Airfields and installations beyond 1,000 miles from known Allied bases received lighter defences. Oil refineries, shipping ports, and supply depots operated with minimal anti-aircraft protection because they were supposedly safe. The 380th's operations systematically exploited these gaps, striking targets that Japanese planners had categorized as low priority for defensive investment. The Luftwaffe never had to revise their assessment of the B-24 as slow or vulnerable, because they never encountered B-24 seconds operating in their designed role. In Europe, Liberators flew in formations with B-17 seconds, maintaining formation speed rather than optimal cruise speed, attacking targets within a few hours flight time from English bases. The missions that revealed the B-24's true capabilities. The marathon flights to distant targets, the sustained operations over vast distances, simply didn't exist in the European theatre. Geography prevented it. From England to Berlin was roughly 600 miles. From Darwin to Balikpapan was 1,300. This created a peculiar situation where two parallel narratives about the same aircraft existed simultaneously. In Europe, the B-24 was the problem child, the bomber that crews didn't want to fly, the aircraft that German fighters preferentially targeted. In the Pacific, it was the only American bomber capable of reaching critical targets, the aircraft that enabled offensive operations across million-square-mile areas, the platform that made strategic bombing of Japanese logistics possible before the B-29 superfortress arrived. The crews flying these missions understood something that never made it into the official assessments. The B-24 wasn't a better bomber than the B-17 or a worse one. It was a different bomber, optimized for different missions. Comparing them in the European theatre was like testing a sports car and a truck on the same racetrack and declaring the sports car superior. Of course, it performed better in that specific context. But ask either vehicle to haul 5 tons of cargo across 1,000 miles of bad road, and the results would reverse. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of the 380th's most experienced pilots, flew both B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds during his career. In post-war interviews, he described the difference succinctly. The B-17 was a pilot's airplane. It felt right, responded predictably. Forgave mistakes. The B-24 was an engineer's airplane. You had to manage it constantly, monitor every system, calculate every fuel burn. But when you needed to fly farther than anyone thought possible, when the mission required maximum range with a useful bomb load, there was no comparison. The B-24 could do things the B-17 simply couldn't. By 1944, the 380th had proven this point repeatedly. Their operations from Darwin covered the entire western half of the Southwest Pacific Theatre, 1 million square miles of ocean and islands where they were, for extended periods, the only heavy bomber unit available. They flew missions that would have been impossible for B-17 units, hitting targets in the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea, the Celebes, Java, and Borneo, with a consistency that forced Japanese forces to spread their defensive resources impossibly thin. The group's second Distinguished Unit Citation, awarded for operations in April and May 1944, highlighted this strategic impact. While Allied forces prepared to invade Hollandia in New Guinea, the 380th flew repeated strikes against Japanese airfields on the Vogelkop Peninsula, hundreds of miles west of the main battle area. These attacks neutralized Japanese air power that could have reinforced the defenses at Hollandia, protecting the western flank of the entire invasion. No other bomber unit could have conducted these missions from existing Allied bases. The distances were simply too great. The Japanese response illustrated the strategic dilemma the B-24's range created. They couldn't defend everywhere. Resources devoted to hardening targets in the Dutch East Indies meant fewer defences elsewhere. Japanese fighters repositioned to counter the 380th's raids left other areas vulnerable. Every hour of flight time the Japanese allocated to patrolling potential bomber approach routes was an hour those fighters weren't available for offensive operations. The B-24's ability to strike from unexpected distances forced Japanese defensive planning into an impossible situation, trying to protect targets across a geographic area too vast for their available resources. When the 380th moved from Darwin to Mindoro in the Philippines in February 1945, they brought nearly 2 years of long-range operational experience with them. The group had flown longer missions more consistently than any other bomber unit in any theatre. They'd perfected fuel management techniques that extended the B-24's already impressive range. They'd developed navigation procedures for missions lasting 14 to 16 hours over open ocean. They'd created maintenance protocols for aircraft operating at maximum gross weight on a regular basis. From their new Philippine bases, they immediately demonstrated what this experience meant. On February 18, 1945, just weeks after arriving at Mindoro, the group struck targets on Formosa, opening a new front in the air campaign against Japanese logistics. In April, they flew the first heavy bomber missions against targets in China and French Indochina, hitting railways, ports, and industrial facilities that had been considered beyond the range of land-based bombers. In June, they conducted pre-invasion strikes against Brunei and Balikpapan again, this time from bases 800 miles closer, allowing them to carry heavier bomb loads and conduct sustained aerial siege operations. The final mission statistics for the 380th tell a story that never fit comfortably into the popular narrative about World War II air power. They flew missions to targets farther from their bases than almost any other bomber group in any theatre. They operated continuously for longer periods with less logistical support than comparable units in Europe. They trained Australian crews to take over their role, transferring not just aircraft, but an entire operational methodology for long-range bombing. And they did all of this with an aircraft that had a reputation for being inferior to the B-17. The irony extends beyond the specific achievements of the 380th. Across the Pacific theatre, B-24 units consistently outperformed expectations based on European combat experience. The aircraft that struggled at high altitude over Germany excelled at medium altitude over the Pacific. The structural vulnerabilities that made it susceptible to German 20mm cannons mattered less against Japanese fighters, primarily armed with lighter weapons. The range that was merely an advantage in Europe became an absolute necessity in the Pacific, where distances between bases and targets routinely exceeded European operational scales. By war's end, the B-24 had dropped more total tonnage of bombs than any other American aircraft. It had flown more combat missions than any other bomber type. It had been produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history, over 18,000 units rolling off assembly lines that, at peak production, delivered one complete bomber every hour. Yet it never achieved the iconic status of the B-17, never captured the public imagination the way the Flying Fortress did, never became synonymous with American air power in the way its predecessor had. The reasons for this disparity are rooted in geography and journalism as much as aircraft performance. The 8th Air Force, flying B-17 seconds from England, operated in the same theatre as hundreds of war correspondents who witnessed and reported on the massive daylight raids over Germany. The newspaper-reading American public saw stories about flying fortresses returning riddled with holes, about heroic crews nursing damaged B-17 seconds back across the English Channel, about the aircraft's legendary durability. These stories were real and deserved the attention they received. But the 380th, flying from Darwin, operated in relative obscurity. Few correspondents covered operations from Northern Australia. The distances involved made it impractical for reporters to accompany missions. When crews returned from 14-hour flights to targets most Americans had never heard of, the stories rarely made it beyond local Australian newspapers. The dramatic achievements, the record-breaking missions, the sustained operations across impossible distances, happened largely without public witness. The legacy of these operations extended far beyond World War II. The techniques developed by B-24 crews for maximum range missions influenced post-war bomber doctrine across multiple air forces. The Soviet Union, analyzing captured German intelligence reports on Allied bomber operations, paid particular attention to the long-range missions in the Pacific. Soviet bomber development in the late 1940s and 1950s emphasized range and endurance, clearly influenced by B-24 operations they'd studied through intelligence channels. The United States Strategic Air Command, formed in 1946, incorporated lessons from 380th operations into their training programs. The concept of sustained long-range strategic bombing, of maintaining pressure on distant targets over extended periods, of operating bombers at the limits of their range regularly rather than occasionally, all drew directly from Pacific B-24 experience. When SAC began planning for intercontinental bombing missions during the Cold War, they referenced operational data from groups like the 380th that had routinely pushed aircraft to maximum range. Modern long-range aviation owes debts to the B-24 that are rarely acknowledged. Commercial aviation's focus on fuel efficiency and range optimization traces technical lineages back to the Davis Wing and the operational techniques developed by crews flying marathon missions. The idea that aircraft design should optimize for endurance rather than just speed or payload came directly from World War II Pacific operations, where range determined mission success or failure. The 380th Bombardment Group was inactivated on February 20, 1946, at Clark Field on Luzon. Most of their B-24 seconds were scrapped on site, bulldozed, into pits and buried, because transporting them back to the United States cost more than the aircraft were worth. A few were flown back as part of the Sunset Project. Most simply disappeared, reduced to scrap metal on Philippine airfields after completing missions that had redefined what heavy bombers could accomplish. The veterans carried memories of missions that most people wouldn't believe. 14-hour flights over open ocean, 16-hour missions where fuel margins were measured in minutes of flight time, operations where navigation errors of just a few degrees meant running out of fuel hundreds of miles from friendly territory. These weren't occasional emergency situations. They were routine operations, the normal rhythm of service, with a unit flying B-24 seconds in their designed role. When these veterans encountered the popular narrative about B-24 seconds, the one that emphasized vulnerabilities and flying difficulties and unfavorable comparisons to B-17 seconds, their reactions were complex. They didn't dispute the facts. The B-24 was harder to fly at high altitude. It was more vulnerable to certain types of combat damage. Crews generally did prefer the B-17's handling characteristics. All of that was true in the European context, where those factors mattered most. But those veterans also knew something the broader narrative missed. They'd flown missions no B-17 could have completed. They'd struck targets that would have been unreachable without the B-24's range. They'd operated in a theater where the aircraft's advantages outweighed its disadvantages by massive margins. The popular story about World War II bombers emphasized one set of priorities. Their experience validated an entirely different set. The Luftwaffe never called the B-24 slow because they never encountered it in circumstances where its speed mattered. German fighter pilots never had to chase Liberators flying sustained cruise for 13 hours, never had to calculate interception courses for bombers that could choose to extend away using superior fuel efficiency rather than just speed, never faced the operational problem of defending targets so distant that bomber range rather than defensive strength determined vulnerability. The word slow implied a comparison in contexts where both aircraft operated under similar constraints. Those constraints simply didn't exist in the Pacific. Japanese commanders learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that American bomber range exceeded their initial assessments by factors large enough to invalidate entire defensive strategies. By 1944, Japanese intelligence reports included specific warnings about B-24 capabilities, noting that installations up to 1,400 miles from known Allied bases should be considered within range and defended accordingly. That revision, forced by operational reality, came too late to protect the targets the 380th had already been hitting for over a year. The final irony is that the B-24's greatest achievements came precisely because it wasn't trying to be a better B-17. Consolidated Aircraft had designed an aircraft optimized for different priorities: range over durability, efficiency over ease of handling, payload over high-altitude performance. Those design choices made it less suitable for the massed daylight raids over Germany. Those same choices made it uniquely suited for the Pacific theater, where geography determined operational possibility. If the B-24 had been designed to match B-17 characteristics, to prioritize the same features the Flying Fortress emphasized, it would have been inadequate for Pacific operations. The 380th couldn't have flown their marathon missions. Allied forces would have lacked the heavy bomber capability to strike deep into Japanese-controlled territory. The oil refineries at Balikpapan would have continued supplying Japanese forces until ground troops could capture them, years later and at enormous cost. Instead, the B-24 existed, filled a role nothing else could fill, and accomplished missions that redefined expectations about what heavy bombers could achieve. It did this while carrying a reputation for inferiority that never quite fit the reality of what it accomplished. The aircraft that couldn't match the B-17's durability flew farther, carried more, and ultimately contributed just as much to Allied victory, just in different ways and different theatres. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.